Well, thanks, Denise, and the Office of Innovation and Education, and all of you for an opportunity to spend some time today visiting. It's been amazing for me over the past couple of days to listen to the conversation, to be a part of conversations around what I think may be the most important issue we face as a nation right now. Clearly in your conversations, there's been this sense that this is important work. The case I want to make with you today is that it's not just important, it is very urgent. We have a window of, I believe, a window of opportunity to do some really amazing things. And it's interesting, in this country, this work gets done in this kind of setting. In some other countries, this sort of work is being done at the federal level, heavily funded, the best minds. That's not the way we've worked. That the magic of innovation in our country has almost always been at the grassroots. That's why these kinds of convenings, these kinds of events, these kinds of conversations are so important. And so thank you for your commitment. Thank you for being a part of this. What I hope to do in our time together today is to give you the most coherent argument I can give you for why this work is critical and why it's critical now. To give you hopefully a clear sense of what this work is, and I know you have in your head a sense of what the work is. I want to push that out a little bit more to help you think about some elements that you might not have, it may not be at a conscious level now. And then before you leave, some really concrete things. In fact, before I finish today, give you 5 things you can do with your students starting tomorrow, or continue if you're already doing them, but some very practical hows around this work. Because we're at a crossroads around teaching, learning, and education. We have a system that served us well in a bygone era. But we have a hard time letting go of it because it represents our past success. In fact, many people can't even imagine what it would be to have a different system. This is the only one we've known. Yet our collective future is dependent on us making changes and getting it right. For learners today, for our future tomorrow. But let me start with this idea of how things used to be, because I think often we forget the context. There actually was a time when we could depend on what we knew as being what we needed to know for a lifetime. In fact, there was a time when technical knowledge doubled about every century. And then it doubled every generation. And then every decade. And then at warp speed, it was doubling every several years. Today, technical knowledge in this world doubles in a matter of months. Knowing what we know today is important. It's what we learn that will make a difference. There was a time when teachers were actually sole source providers of academic knowledge and skills. In fact, they were the place you went to find academic information. There weren't that many other places. In fact, information sources were generally confined to school, to church, to family, maybe the radio, and maybe the library if you have it. We got power outage here? Or just going to... Okay. No, we're good. Oh, we're good. All right. Today, I can access the world's knowledge in a matter of a few seconds, academic and otherwise. Yet we have a system that largely is built as though the teachers are the experts, the sole source providers of knowledge. There was a time when accumulating just content knowledge was adequate for learning. In fact, it was important because we didn't have other sources. We had to memorize. We had to be able to connect dates and times and sequences because that information wasn't readily available through other sources. Today, the value add is in making connections, understanding context, figuring out significance. Is content still important? You bet. but absent context, connections, meaning, it's of limited value. There was a time, some of us can even recall this, when we could equip students with a skill and be relatively confident that they could use that to earn a living for a lifetime. Stefan Turnipseed, who is the former director of Lego Learning, said, the careers of today's learners will look more like product cycles. That every 5 to 7 years, not just a new job, a whole new career that requires a whole new set of learning, a whole new set of skills. And by the way, there actually was a time when we competed with the person who sat next to us down the block or in the next community. And already today, we and our learners compete with people around the globe we'll never meet. We'll still compete with people down the street and in the next community, but that competition is so much broader. So why would I say this to you? Because this is the world for which our schools were designed. This is what we were designed to do. Let me give you another sort of way of thinking about this. Yesterday, John Spencer said, our schools aren't broken. He was right. Our schools are actually better by most every objective measure than they've ever been. If anything, we've optimized the design. In the face of a changing environment, increasing challenges. In fact, in the chart, by the way, this is not to scale, this is just to illustrate. So those of you that are math teachers out there, give me a break. It's okay. This is just an illustration. But the gray line in the bottom is intended to represent sort of the performance of our schools, kind of where have we been. In the 1890s, the Committee of 10 got together and pretty much laid out the architecture of the schools we have today. In fact, this is really remarkable. 120 years later, if you sat down and said, what's the sort of fidelity to the original design, we're at probably about 70%. Our schools are pretty much as they were designed. Now, we've made changes along the way, but for the most part, the core design has remained as it always was. Now, that work in its time was brilliant. In fact, I think you could make an argument that our emergence from largely an agrarian country to a world industrial power was in major part driven by our education system, because it enculturated people. It gave people a common experience. By the way, it also gave people the experience of repetitive tasks under close supervision during long periods of boredom, which was exactly what we needed for the moving assembly line. Some kids would say, that still sounds a lot like school today. But it matched well with our economy. We were producing workers, a population. We only needed about 30% to go on to higher ed, to be learning at high levels, to be clergy, to be captains of industry, to be our professionals, to be our intellectuals, our academics. The rest we needed to go into a workforce where high levels of knowledge and ability to learn wasn't highly valued. In fact, had we engineered it for that to be the case, we would have had economic chaos because we didn't have jobs for people. But over time, what's happened is, while our schools have continued to get better, the expectations, the needs of our society and economy have grown at a more rapid pace. That's the red line. Now, seminal moment around that, when this was sort of brought to sort of an urgent sense, occurred in the early 1980s, and I look around, probably very few of you were in this business at the time. Some of us were. The National Commission on Excellence in Education, better known for their report, The Nation at Risk, looked at this data, actually, back in the early 80s. They saw this gap emerging and were worried about it, concerned about it. The problem is that they concluded that gap was caused by lack of accountability, lack of effort, lack of compliance. And so the report largely said, we've got to expect more out of students. They've got to earn more credits. We've got to push them harder. And by the way, educators, they got to be much more accountable. We've got to do a lot more evaluation. We've got to push them harder. Their bet was that if we just got more effort out of people, this problem would be solved. They didn't see it as a design problem. They saw it as a people problem. So if you look at most school reform improvement initiatives in the past 30 years, they've largely been driven by that time frame, by that mind frame. Let's push harder. It's why there's so much pressure in the system today. But here's the reality. There is no reserve of energy and effort out there. We're given what we've got. And more effort wouldn't solve it necessarily anyway. By the way, it's also true that more money won't solve it by itself. Do we need more money? Yes. Is there enough money to solve this? Not really. It's not a money problem primarily. It's not an effort problem primarily. It is a design problem. The problem is the design. Unfortunately, we beat people up, we criticize, we blame, we shame, when they're not the problem. The problem is the design. Now, you may be saying, okay, well, that's an interesting claim, but what's your evidence? Well, let me give you just a few pieces of what does that gap mean for us? That gap means 1.2 million young people every year, on average, leave our schools before graduation. Not because they aren't capable of doing the work, and there's a recent Gates study on this. It's because they don't see the relevance. They don't see the connection. They don't see that experience as in any way connecting to the rest of their lives. The McKinsey Group, an international consulting company, has looked at the impact of that gap, and particularly around dropouts, and said, it represents for us, in economic terms, a near permanent recession. That if we just solved that piece, our economy would take off. Buried in that 1.2 million are 50,000 young people who leave our schools every year prematurely, who have already been identified as intellectually gifted. What are we leaving on the table for those gifted kids who leave without having finished their education? That gap represents hundreds of thousands of students every year who fail and fail and fail and finally are placed in remediation, a process that's expensive and largely ineffective. When we know that if we could intervene at the first point when kids fall off their trajectory, it would be far more effective, far less expensive. And by the way, think for a moment about the word remediation. It's a synonym for fix. When we say we're going to remediate kids, so think about what we do with contaminated ground. That's what we do, we fix it. When we say we're going to remediate students, what we're saying is the problem's not us, it's you. And so we treat it as though they're the problem, not the system, not the approach. That gap represents tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of students each year who end up with an IEP. The point at which we say, how does this student learn best, and could we find a way to teach them the way they learn? What if we asked that question upstream at the beginning? And we didn't have students who fail and fail and fail and fail until they conclude they're incapable of learning. The most difficult student to teach is the student who believes they can't learn. And our system systematically gives kids this experience over and over and over again. That gap represents students who seemingly have succeeded in our system. That is, they graduate from high school, go on to two-year colleges. In this country, 75% of high school graduates who go on to two-year colleges have to take remedial math, remedial English, or both. Now, you might say, but we don't send our best students to two-year colleges. We send them to four. That number in four-year colleges is 40%. And by the way, those students who have to take remedial math or English almost never end up with degrees on the high end, the high challenge end, if they make it to the end. So we're paying a very high price. But the point here is, it's not the people. It's the design of the system. And that is something we can do something about. So let me give you, here's a metaphor. I love metaphors, but here's a metaphor for what I think is our problem. Anybody recognize what that is? It's old. It's a typewriter. This is the old manual typewriter, which, by the way, from a technology perspective, was an amazing invention. It took what had been the purview of professional printers and put it in the hands of the common man. In fact, when I was in high school, if you were going on to college, you better take typing 1 and typing 2. You had to learn how to do this. But it was an amazing invention. We even had teachers whose full-time assignment was teaching typing. That's what they did. How do you format letters? How do you do all that sort of work? And it served us well for a long time. It was a major bump in productivity, and it served us well. Then, fast forward into the 1980s. And so people like Wang and others looked at this piece of technology and said, I think we could do more with that. And they introduced what we knew at the time as word processing. An amazing thing, by the way, if you're not familiar with it. Word processing would actually allow you to type a letter, and through this very complicated process of mail merge, you could actually send out letters to multiple people that looked like it was personal to them. How about that, huh? That was a big deal. Let me tell you, if you had to type every letter individually, and suddenly you could do this through this process, you could now, this is a major jump in productivity. Well, that gave rise to a whole cascading number of applications and opportunities. And today, many of you are carrying around in your bag or maybe on the table with you right now this sort of productivity capacity that so far eclipses the typewriter that's hard even to imagine. One of the major ways we still enter information is through a keyboard, not that far from the typewriter. But just think with me about this. If you gave a member of your staff that piece of equipment and asked them to do their work during the day, at the end of the day, would you criticize them because they are not as productive as they are if we use the technology we have now? No, that'd be foolish. We'd say, we need a different design here. They need something that gives them an opportunity to be more productive. Well, in many ways, that's exactly where we sit. There are ways. Many of you are engaging in those strategies that go beyond. Our task is to redesign the system in a way that allows that productivity not to be on the exception, not to be the sort of or an ad hoc, but that's the way we operate. Now, my claim is that we have a system design problem, which means that there are elements of the design that are problematic. Let me share just 5 of what I would say are the most obvious, but I could give you a dozen. Here's one. Just think of this. Why is it that we hold time and instruction as constants rather than learning? We decide before the year starts how much time kids have to learn. We decide how they're going to learn it, and we hope they learn. The problem is many of them don't. What if we held learning as the constant, and we used time and instruction as very valuable, flexible resources to support that work? Doesn't that make more sense in an institution that's supposed to be about learning? How about this? Why is it that we group students by age rather than readiness? If you have a sibling, if you've been a parent of more than one child, or you've taught more than 15 minutes, you know that's not a good assignment. That's not a good assumption, right? Seriously. I mean, you take attendance, you'll get that information. Yet it drives what we do every day. In fact, think of this. And I can spend 15 minutes on this piece. Just think of this. In most of our states, this assumption means that a 5-minute difference in your birth places you in one grade or another, right? Just before midnight, just after. That date might be September 1. There's a wealth of research about that impact. Yet we let it go year after year. It's codified in statute. There is no research to support it, only tradition. But it's part of our design. How about this? Why do we allow cycles of failure and remediation rather than designing a system that allows us to intervene early when kids start to struggle? In fact, when it happens now, it's because we work around the system to get to the kids. Because the system isn't designed to intervene early. In fact, if you think about the metaphor of the assembly line, the early assembly line left all the problems until they got to the end of the line, and then they try and fix them. Even assembly lines now stop and fix the problem when it happens. They don't let it go. But we're still caught in an old model that doesn't do that. How about this? Why is it that we tolerate assessment systems that are based on response rather than representation? Here's what I mean. Most of our large-scale testing is done based on prompts, right, or questions. They're very efficient. They're very efficient. Here's the problem. To really understand what kids know, you have to ask a lot of questions. You have to be sure that those questions tap the most important information. And you have to be sure that the learner understands the intent of that question so you don't get a false positive. And you don't know if the answer was a guess or was actually informed. It's highly problematic and frankly means that much of the information that we use to make high-stake decisions about students' learning future is not based on very good information. And it goes unexamined. On the other hand, when we allow students to represent what they've learned, whether that's through a task or through teaching or through building a model, what happens is we now get access to a full scope of what they know. The extent to which their understanding is coherent and it's clear, and they're able to take what they've learned and apply it in a meaningful way. But our system is still running, largely based on assessment that grows out of questions, not demonstration. And here's the last one. That's just sort of, at least for this conversation. Most incentives and sanctions in our schools are based on compliance. Just think about that for a moment. Our incentives and sanctions are based on compliance. Doing what you're told, which is a fine thing, except that the world values commitment, not just compliance. There was a time when compliance was enough, and I'm not arguing against compliance. I'm just saying that if all we're focusing on is compliance, that's what we get. But we're trying to prepare them for a world where commitment is the differentiator. Why wouldn't we want to design our system around incentives for commitment, for persistence, for going beyond, rather than simply doing the minimum that we ask? As I told you, we could go on. I could give you at least a dozen of these. Here's what strikes me. I suspect that there isn't anybody in this room who believes the assumption on which these design principles rest. Yet we are caught in a system where they drive the decisions. They drive the allocation of resources. They drive the structure of what's going on. But we can change it. But here's our problem. What I just described in this sort of legacy-based system flies in the face of the challenge we have today. Projections are that the majority of jobs today's learners will have as adults do not yet exist. And they'll require skills that have yet to be defined. So simply saying, here's the job, here's the technical skill, doesn't make it. In fact, if that's what we were doing, that is, not giving kids the whole rich experience, but we're giving them a narrow sort of technical skill, we're shortchanging them. Within a decade, they're without a skill. When that skill's no longer needed, they've got nothing to offer. So let me challenge you for a moment. I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk. I've been talking a lot. And by the way, unless you talk, you don't learn. So we're going to just stop for a moment. This is a quote from Roland Barthes, that actually a Harvard professor. This actually was from some time ago, but it still strikes me. Just look at this. He says, in the 1950s, students left high school knowing about 75% of what they needed to succeed in life and career, which meant, by the way, they still had to learn 25%. It's a big piece. Today's students, even though by virtually every quantifiable message, when our kids on average leave high school, they're better educated than their 1950s counterparts, Barth says they know about 2% of what they need to know. So here's the question. What should that 2% be? The best we can do is leave, by the way, we can argue whether it's 2%, 5%, 10%, not really the point. Here's the question. If we're preparing them for a future that we can't predict, that we can't see, what should we be darn sure when they leave us they've got? So I'm going to just stop, give you 2-3 minutes. If you would at your table, you can talk about anything I've talked about so far, but I would love you to just talk for a moment about what is it we need to do? What should that 2% or 5% be in order to prepare them for the other 95 or 98% they're going to have to learn after they're gone? Does anyone want to share? You say, if we could just, if there are 1 or 2 things we could give them, it ought to be this. Anyone want to venture? Just stand up and shout it out. What's critical? We're the experts. We should know. What?
Problem solving.
Problem solving. Great. What else? Designing. What else?
Learning.
Learning. Holy cow. Talk some more about that.
No pressure, Sarah.
Yes, but what to say?
So they need to know how to learn.
Yes.
And
Yes.
how to find out what they don't know and how to figure it
Yep.
out and to decide if they did it right or didn't do it right.
So in the context of design work and all the other things we need, yes, that if they don't know how to learn, they're stuck. But let me add one more thing to that, and absolutely so. Yes, learning and an inclination to do so. It's one thing for me to know how to learn. It's quite another for me to have an inclination to do so without always being prompted or told or forced to do so. Which then speaks to the way we approach this work with learners in terms of building a sense of curiosity, a sense of need and pressure and investigating. But this sense that learning is not something I know how to do. It's something I really want to do. Unfortunately, in our schools, often in our pursuit of teaching kids skills, we often extinguish their desire to use it. And we need both of those. We need and certainly there are components of that knowing how to learn that are really critical. But in sort of what's our work, it's about making sure that in that other 98%, they know how to learn and they're inclined to do so. That we build that thirst within them. Now, despite the fact that we don't know what those jobs will be exactly, there are things we know about those jobs that are important for us to understand. So here's a way of thinking about what do we know? Let me propose 3 sort of big buckets of the sort of work that today's learners will do in the future. The first one is really this idea of jobs for which learners apply and that require primarily following instructions. Or they apply, they're hired, they're trained, and they do that work. These jobs will be around and will be relatively plentiful. The problem is that these kinds of jobs are not highly valued in the workplace anymore. In fact, many employers look at these jobs as overhead, not productivity. They constantly want to know, can I automate it or can I outsource it? So if we're preparing our students for this sort of job, we need to have them be prepared. They're going to need about 3 of them just to support themselves. And they're going to constantly be applying for new ones because their employers are trying to eliminate the job they have. Here's the problem. Our schools were designed to prepare graduates for these jobs. That's what they were designed to do. Follow instructions, do what you're told, know how to be trained, and then use that to do exactly what you're told. The jobs will be there. They're not going to pay very much. You're going to be highly fluid. A second category are jobs for which today's learners will apply. There will be an expectation of what they know, but they'll be hired for what they can learn. Because The world is changing such that virtually every business is going to have to change with it. If you hire me today for what I know, the most valuable, the greatest value I present is my first day of work. If I'm not learning, if I'm not a learner. On the other hand, if you hire me and I'm constantly out there searching, probing, ready to learn, 6 months from now I'm a better asset. 12 months from now I'm a more valuable asset. The differentiator is the ability to learn, not just the fact that I know. Not enough. But there's a third category. This is a category of jobs for which learners won't apply. These are jobs they create. They see a niche, a possibility, a problem, something they can do that will create a job for themselves. This, by the way, is the fastest growing portion of our economy and will continue to be so. Some kids are going to make a lot of money doing this. Some aren't going to make very much. But for most of them, this will be the best job they ever have in their life because it's their job. They created it. There are growing opportunities in the economy for this, but here's the problem. What are we doing in schools to prepare kids for the third category? John Spencer talked about yesterday about the whole idea, this whole design work fits right in this. Makerspace fits right in this. But ultimately, this needs to be closer to the core of our work, not the fringe. What are we doing in terms of how we're engaging kids in learning in ways that help them see opportunities, that help them and support them to pursue areas of interest, maybe even develop a product or a service while they're still in school? What do we have in our system that's supporting it? That's part of this change in design. So here's our fundamental problem. I gave you what I think of the challenge. Here's the fundamental problem. We have a system that was designed for the agrarian or early industrial economy. We did everything we could through the knowledge economy to try and make it work. Now we face the innovation economy, where constant learning, new ideas are the currency. Yet we're relying, our bet is on a system that's largely driven by compliance and predictability. This is a conversation we need to have among ourselves. This is a conversation we need to have with local employers. This is a conversation we need to have with parents. This is not an issue of pushing people harder. This is not an issue of shame and blame. This is an issue of design. In fact, thinking about the answer, we've got 30 plus years of pressure, accountability, more shame and blame. Not the answer. The answer lies in our figuring out ways to redesign the system, to give it the capacity necessary to prepare our learners for their future. Not their parents' future, not their grandparents' future, not their great-grandparents' future, their future. And their future is very different in ways we can't, right now, maybe not even imagine. But there are things we can do to prepare them for it. The tools, the attitudes, but what's it going to take? So here's a sort of an interesting thing. If you look at most classrooms in this country, the most underutilized resource is sitting right in front of us, the student. We treat them as raw material, when in fact they're actually the resource. Learning starts where the learner is, not where the lesson anticipates they are or should be, or what the curriculum says it should be. Learning starts where the learner is. If we can unleash this really powerful resource sitting in every classroom, we can turn the world upside down. Here's the best news about it. It's free and it's not illegal. We can do this. We can do this. Which takes me to sort of, this is the, you remember the movie City Slickers? Remember Curly said this one thing, but he never said what that one thing was. Well, here's the one thing. This is not a silver bullet, by the way. This is the fulcrum for change. Not the silver bullet, the fulcrum. And it's something we have known forever, and that is learning is a personal autonomous, self-constructed process. So being exposed to instruction by itself isn't learning. Each of us connect with what we're hearing in different ways. Right now, you're putting what I'm saying in your context. It may be opening up ideas. It may be creating uncertainty. It may be creating an argument, which would be fabulous. The point is, none of us can learn from each other. We need a system that's designed to ensure that each learner sees him or herself as their best resource for learning, that our approach develops that resource, that over time positions them to become their own best teacher. Because it's the only teacher that will go with them for a lifetime. Isn't that worth investing in? They may hear our voice in their ear 20 years from now. I still hear some of my teachers' voices in my ear, and it's a lot more than 20 years. But the best teacher needs to be themselves. What are we doing to give them the skill set, the attitudes, the understanding necessary for them to become ultimately independent learners? Not compliant, not just able to follow instructions, although there are times when they're important. But ultimately, the question is, how are we developing their capacity? So let me just stop for a moment and clear something up. There are people who think that personalized learning is customized instruction to the learner. While that's part of the work, the real work is developing the learner as a learner. Helping them develop capacity is really what this is about, which means this can't be an add-on task for teachers to try and customize for every learner. This is about building the capacity of learners to be co-creators, co-inventors, co-path builders for their learning so that ultimately they're able to create their own path. They're able to set their own goals. They're able to monitor their progress because in their futures, that's critical. Does that make sense? Just as a way to get at it. So here's a way to sort of think about first piece, broad brush, new model. Our legacy model says teacher, sole source provider, expert, plans the lessons, delivers the best they can to the students, hoping the students get it. If they don't, they do the best they can to try and help them get it. But the last thing we do in the legacy system is judge whether they learned or not, right? We call it grading. We assign a grade, even if it happens that a student didn't learn, we move on. We start the next unit as though everybody learned everything in the last unit when everybody knows that's not true. So the difference now in terms of thinking about the new design is this. Learner and educator, we're in this thing together. We're in this together. I can't be successful if you're not. So let's find ways. Let's find ways to work together. So we're setting goals together. We're creating paths together. And my work as the educator is always to build your capacity to be able to do this without me eventually. Not to always be dependent on me. So I want to give you opportunities around that. Here, the last piece is ensuring that learning happened, which is why we talk about competencies, competency-based learning, not instructional exposure-based learning. It's a different thing. Stay with it for a bit, you'll get it. Here's the good news, or another piece of good news, and that is there is a whole lot of research that supports the work we're about. Some of it is very recent, some of it's been around for a long time. I promise not to geek out on this. This could be 3 times the length, but I'll just give you a couple of things. Bandura's work on efficacy goes back in the 1970s. This idea that strategy and belief in my ability to impact my world is a critical element in success in life and learning. Within the context of education, Wakefield and Wagner's piece says, in academic self-efficacy has 3 parts to it. One is the idea that is the use of good strategies. The second is smart effort, and the third is resources. That is, an understanding that if I use good strategies and smart effort and my resources, I can learn really difficult things. That the fact that I tried it once and I didn't get it right is only an invitation to learn and move forward. It's not evidence that I can't learn. And for many kids, one try, an unsuccessful attempt, is tantamount for them to not being able to learn. It's a very empowering approach. Black and Williams talked a lot about the whole idea of formative assessment and feedback. Schlechty's work, if you're familiar with Phil Schlechty's idea that we ought to be thinking about the learner as the worker and educators as the designers of work, not the workers. Carol Dweck's work, and if you're not familiar with it, you ought to do that this weekend before you get back on Monday. But the whole idea of a growth mindset, that smart is something we become, not something we're born with. And I could go on. In fact, interestingly, Bloom, we think of Bloom a lot about the whole idea of Bloom's taxonomy, and he's been well known for that. But here's what's interesting. In the early 1980s at the University of Chicago, using mastery learning techniques that have certainly some overlap with what we're talking about, we're able to show dramatic growth in learning by engaging kids where they are with what's of interest to them, giving them rigorous work. The problem was in the early 80s, they didn't have the technology to scale it up. Our work is not, by the way, to prove this works. It's how we scale it and sustain it. That's really the challenge we face. All right, I'm going to just quickly, because there are other things I want to get to, and I want to give you some opportunity to talk. But here's sort of from the Institute for Personalized Learning. Here's our definition. I just want to point out three things. One is this idea that our work ought to be driven by readiness, strengths, needs, and interests. They're the moving parts around which we build learner capacity. And we know this from Hattie's work, just the idea that when learners set goals for their own learning, achievement goes up. In fact, you get an effect size that's greater than a year's learning in a year, just by having kids take seriously this idea of setting goals. Now, granted, we have to provide support and instruction around it, but think about this as a process. We work with learners to set goals for their learning that's relevant to where they are, that taps their needs, interests, strengths in that process, and then help them co-construct a learning path. Early on, we can take heavy responsibility in this. Here's what I can provide. Here's a seminar I'm going to do. Here are some strategies I think would be useful. Here are some resources. But here's the crucial question. What, as a learner, are you going to invest? What are you going to invest? And that could be as little as, I'm going to spend 10 minutes a day practicing this skill. Or, I'm going to go to Ryan because Ryan just learned this skill, and Ryan learns a lot the same way I do. And I think that working with Ryan, that would be helpful for me. Or it may be that I'm going to go find an app that I think would be useful for this, or some information. Here's the key. When learners co-construct the learning path, they're far more likely to persist when they struggle. It becomes their path as well as ours, not just our path. They're not just walking our path. It's now one they've co-invested in. And then the third part of that, this idea of tracking progress. Why is it that we take sole responsibility to track progress on behalf of kids? Now, it's important for us to do that, but Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Boys Club, Girls Club have learned for a long time that giving kids information to track their progress is a really powerful motivator. How about investing some time for kids to become savvy consumers of data so that they too can analyze what's going on, that they have a reason for the feedback we try to give them? I don't know if you've ever experienced something. This happens every once in a while. You try to give feedback to a student who doesn't want it. You ever have that happen to you? Hello? Maybe all the time. Here's the point. This builds the thirst for feedback because the learner co-owns the data. It's not our data that we're putting on them. This is data we've shared. Let's talk about what that means. And then ultimately, to have conversations with kids about how are they going to show us what they've learned. How can they show us? That might be a traditional quiz or exam. It might be a teaching demonstration. Maybe they're going to teach the rest of the class. Maybe they're going to build a model. Maybe they're going to present in front of a panel of experts. But the point is, when they participate in that, we now build also informed, thoughtful assessors of their own learning. Which, by the way, again, if you're familiar with Hattie's work, this idea of teaching students to self-assess is among the most powerful strategies we could give them. That's all embedded in this. So what this means is that at any point in time, kids may be at different places. But this is not about learn anything you want. We're in institutions where there is an accountability for learning. We've decided by whatever means what the competencies or standards ought to be. This is about how we construct paths to get kids there in a system that has that broad accountability to it. It's not about going any direction all the time. However, there are times when we need to give kids the flexibility to say, what do you want to learn? How can we help you do that? That might not be connected to a specific standard or competency. That's just driven by their own passion, by their interests. We need both. So from my perspective, we pull this all down into sort of, what does this really mean? Well, number one, it's this. Our work is to nurture powerful learners, not just good students. Now, being a good student, or the skills necessary to be a good student, I would argue are a subset of those skills that learners need. But we're not preparing today's learners to be students. We're preparing them for a life of learning, much of which will not come as the result of a professionally prepared, perfectly timed lesson. Not going to happen, especially if they're learning things nobody else knows. That we need to prepare students to have strategies available to know what to do when they don't know what to do. That I'm not caught. I have strategies. I can figure this out. This is not an argument that we shouldn't develop good study skills. This is just that our work is bigger than that. Our work is about building capacity, not just delivering customized instruction. It's a part of it. But a larger piece is developing powerful learners. The second, and this is really part of that whole process, and that is we need learners to think about themselves as partners, and we need to invite them to be partners, real partners, in identifying learning goals and developing paths and creating learning experiences and shared accountability. Because if we continue to assume all of that, we deprive them of the capacity to do it on their own, and we shortchange their future. Or we relegate them to figuring that out on their own at some point later in life. And the last part of this, and this has been part of our conversation over the last couple of days, is this idea of thinking about competency, or that is progress that's based on learning rather than on time or exposure to instruction. By the way, here's a quick side thing just around language. And that is, we talk a lot about kids meeting standards. For the eyes of a learner, meeting someone else's standards is just that. It's somebody else's standard. But when we talk about kids about competency and building competence, what we're talking with them about is, what is this for you? You're a more competent person as opposed to simply able to meet somebody else's standard. Now, I'm not arguing against standards. I'm just saying that our language matters. And the more we can talk about this work through the voice of learners, the more likely they are to have it resonate and take root with them, as opposed to talking in system talk. So what does this look like? And I've heard many of these characteristics over the last couple of days. I'll just quickly, shortly into our work, so maybe the second or third year, we have particularly principals saying, so if I walk into a classroom where personalized learning is going on, what do I see? And largely what they meant was, what is the teacher doing? I'm seriously. So what we decided to do is fan out across classrooms and look at what students were doing, because we felt that was better evidence, especially given this model. And so we saw, as we sort of watched and kept coding, working around, about 12 things that were pretty characteristic. Not that all of them were there all the time. In fact, rarely were all of them present or visible at any time. But the idea really is looking at what does this mean for students. So I'm going to give these to you quickly, and I'm going to share a video with you where you have an opportunity to sort of look for these within context. What we saw was that learners were pretty well able to tell us what the purpose was. Why were they learning what they're learning? Beyond Friday's test, beyond I'm going to need it sometime off in the future, but they had a sense around, it was a goal they had, it was something that was driving their learning, that was purposeful. The idea that they could learn. This was not a matter of, I've tried it and I couldn't do it, so I just stopped. But this idea that if I use good strategies and work hard, I can figure this out. Ownership for learning. That is, that learners saw learning as something they were doing for themselves, not just to get adult approval or to avoid the wrath of adults. A flexible pace. And again, this varied depending on context, depending on teacher tolerance, but that by and large, there was some flexibility in pace that was responsive to the learner's needs, not the pacing guide or the expectation of the lesson. That learners had a sense of voice. That is, that what I think is respected. And here's an important piece around voice, by the way. And that is, what is said in this classroom is judged based on its value, not the status of the person who said it. When we think about voice, and by the way, think about this in faculty meetings. How often it is that the voice of people with status get more attention, more validating than the voice of someone who doesn't but may have greater insight, who may have a stronger, more weighty thought. If we're serious about voice for kids, we need to be sure that that voice is given equal, full consideration, regardless of the past performance of the learner or the misbehavior from yesterday. That learner choice is there. By the way, voice and choice, I would argue, are entry points to building ownership. When I have an opportunity to choose, when my voice is being heard, I now have an investment. Which, by the way, when that sort of starts this piece that says, I'm doing the learning for me, I've made some choices, I've made some investment. It's a good starter place to help kids start developing goals for learning. Because that's part of a choice-making process that moves up in terms of the continuum. The other pieces around this idea that learners are resources for learning. There's flexibility for learning both physically and psychologically. That learning differently is really fine, and needing space for that is good. That commitment was the focus, not just compliance. In fact, what we found was, and we found this, by the way, to be almost universally true, that as soon as learners start to experience learning this way, misbehavior almost drops off the map. That when kids feel like they have a voice, that they're co-investors, that they're setting goals along with adults, the sort of power differential almost dissipates. And there's no reason for me to fight with myself. And I don't feel like someone is constantly controlling my every move. Anyway, we also saw technology supported around scaling, but it was not as primarily a technology initiative. And that ultimately, learners saw themselves as becoming able to be more independent. There's a whole lot more of this, I think, probably on our website if you're interested in it. Some blogs around it, so I'll stop with that. But what I do want to do is share with you now about a 3-4 minute video that picks up and I think depicts a lot of this. It's a video that was made by the Council of Chief State School Officers called The Next State of Learning. I think, but Ryan, you can check me. I think it was New Hampshire, Kentucky, Wisconsin, Colorado. And this is the Wisconsin video. By the way, the audience for this was primarily State Department people, not necessarily us. But the message, I think, within this is strong enough, and you can see within this through an educator lens to see its power. And I think you'll see a number of these elements, and in fact, I would ask you to pay attention because I'm going to give you some time when it's over to do a little bit of analysis. Just a word about the school. It's Horning Middle School in Waukesha, Wisconsin, which is just west of Milwaukee. It's the Flight Academy, which is an academy within the middle school. It has continued to grow every year, and at some point, I think, will become the school. It's called the Flight Academy not because they teach aviation. It's actually an acronym, and they'll tell you about that. These are just regular middle school kids doing some really amazing things in an amazing environment. So I don't know if I need to turn this on or if you turn it on from back there. Let me see if I can do it. I can. Here you go.
Middle school, I think my biggest memory is 4 walls, 30 desks.
A different teacher for everything and chaos in between.
Constant movement, constant shifting, one classroom to another.
So everybody did the same projects, you all had the same outcome of your project, kind kind of standard.
Pretty much sat there all day listening to lectures.
I didn't like middle school, truthfully, when I was her age at all.
It was nothing like this.
We're not preparing today's learners for your future, we're preparing them for theirs. If we educate learners as though the future is predictable, we're shortchanging them. That we need to prepare them for a future that will feature rapid change and will be unpredictable.
If it keeps going, don't take it out. Wait till it stops.
Why do we ask kids to just sit in a room and listen to one person for hours on end and expect that they're going to be able to take something away from it? If we can engage them in the experience and have them be an active participant in it, that's really when we're going to start to see change happen.
Since becoming a mom, I realized that all kids have special needs, and I want those needs to be addressed on a daily basis. I want them to be able to learn what it is that they're passionate about and what they love. We can't talk about history without talking about science. We can't talk about history without talking about math. All of these things are interrelated.
Krista Crowder and I had been teaching on the 7th grade team, so I approached her and I said, I think I want to do something different. We really spent a full year in development of trying everything from how we teach to setting up physical space to furniture within a space. It was really that collaboration that built this idea of what are we going to do. The Flight Academy stands for Facilitating Learning Through Integration, Guidance, High Expectations, and Technology. We are a specialized program within a traditional middle school.
I want each kid to be setting their own goals, knowing what they want to work on in all of their different subject areas, and really having different paths for each one of our students.
Learning is like a different thing for every single person. They have high expectations for us. They give us high school work sometimes, and it's kind of crazy, but they challenge us in a way that we're trusted with a lot of responsibility.
I have advanced humanities since I wanted to grow more, as I'm a writer and a reader as well.
The one-on-one advisor is like a conference. We have it every week where we get to talk about like what I've been working on and see how far I am in a certain thing. Probably right here on the
Yes, good idea. All right, thanks, Logan.
The role of educators in that environment is subtle, it's nuanced, but it is constantly supporting the learner as opposed to demonstrating the expertise of the educator. That it is all about learning, not just about instruction.
Getting to a structure and policy change might take some time. Getting it right in the forefront with students today is a huge benefit to our system during this time of transition. And for the most part, everything we're doing happens at the local level. It's where the best decisions are made, it's where we have the greatest source of impact. And it's really where ultimately the user is, or our student.
That's it? Yeah, that is it.
I believe our department does exhibit empathetic leadership, where you understand the interaction that has to happen at the local and state level. As parents see the value of personalized learning, they push that at the local level. And as different districts see things going on, they want to emulate the ones that are successful. They tend to take pride in regional achievement and success.
I kind of learned that I like the freedom of learning.
I know that he's happy, and I know that he's really learning because he comes back with the solution himself.
I really like just exploring everything, and that's exactly what Flight offers. It's allowed me to be a lot more independent at school and at home.
What I've learned about my daughter is that she is infinitely more capable than I ever thought she was.
In elementary school, I didn't get all my work done and stuff, but now it's definitely a first thing basis to get my work done, turn all my stuff in, and be a positive influence to the others.
If you would just take a second, turn to the person next to you. I'll put up those characteristics of a personalized learning environment, but here's what I'd like you to just think about. What did this reinforce for you in terms of helping kids becoming independent learners? What questions did it raise? What surprised you about it? But just I'm going to give you a minute or so, if you would, just turn to the person next to you at your table. What did this stir up for you in terms of your own thinking? Okay, if I could just call you back. Thank you for that. And by the way, I'm hoping that at this point you have questions. We have to always all have questions. Questions we have yet to figure out. Questions we're still trying to frame. So while we're learning, we ought to also be getting new questions. This is not about answering all of our questions now, as much as it is the whole idea of continuing to explore and learn through the questions that we have. So the first part of this presentation, we talked about the why. I gave you my best arguments for why I think this is not only important, but urgent. In the second part, we talked about what? Sort of what is this? What I'd like to do in the time we have left is sort of, so what are the hows? How do we get at this work? This is a place where we have learned a lot from people like you who've been doing this work, particularly over the last 8 years. And it's led us to develop a model that has worked really well for us, but we continue to learn from that model and are constantly changing it. We call it honeycomb. And by the way, we use the honeycomb as a model because it's not linear. It allows multiple paths. It allows you to create a path or a constellation for your work. It is not a do everything or do nothing. It's do more of, do less of. This is work that is a journey. And this word has been used a couple of times, or a few times in the last couple of days. Let me just say this. We are all on a journey. And each of us need to figure that journey out for ourselves. The beauty of that as a metaphor is that it means sometimes we're going to go fast and sometimes we're going to go slow. Sometimes I want to stop and take a side trip. That's the nature of learning. But here's the point. The most important step in a journey is the next one. And the question is, what's your next step? What do you want to do next? So let me give you some ideas. The way we've looked at this work, and we've come to sort of understand it, is around three core fundamental components, or what we call our innovation platform. The first piece is this idea of learning a lot more about the learner as a learner, but equally important that the learner knows him or herself. Because if we want them to become independent learners, if we want them to be participants, they need to have as much information about themselves as a learner as we do. In fact, maybe more. The second part of this is being really clear about where we're headed. We talk about proficiency-based progress. You can call it competency. But here's really what we've discovered to be the crucial element, and that is, what is it you're asking me to learn and why? What's interesting is we often will talk with kids about what and not spend any time on why. And then we wonder why kids aren't committed to learning. Now, that can be giving them a purpose. It can be exploratory conversations. There are a lot of ways we could get to that. But if we ignore the purpose, we shouldn't be surprised when kids abandon the work. We do things that have an important purpose for us. And then in the middle, the customized learning path, people sometimes get panicked by this, but I've actually already given it to you. The customized path is just about learners setting goals for their learning that we do in connection with them, helping them be co-creators of the learning path, being wise, informed consumers of data that helps them monitor progress along with us, and to have some input or discussion around the way to be assessed. I mean, so it can be magical, not magic. It can make a big difference, but it's manageable. And over time, by the way, learners take more and more responsibility for that customized path, that we become less and less sage on the stage, or even guide on the side. We become spending most of our time as mentor in the middle, where the work is actually happening. Now, here's an important element around this. And that is, this is work that needs to start at the core, and the core is the intersection of teaching and learning. Most education reform in this country has been done around structures and policies that never gets to the core, the intersection of teaching and learning, which is where this happens. In fact, if we don't change the experience of the learner, we don't change the outcome. And so much of what we've done in the name of reform never got to the learner. It stayed at the adult level and never really fundamentally changed the experience of the learner. That's what this work is about. So starting at the core, and I know you're not going to be able to read this. A number of you from sessions that other members of the Institute team had presented, have this in hard copy, but I would just say, go to the Institute website. It's Institute 4PL. There's an interactive, it's actually an interactive honeycomb. You can click on these core elements and get a video that describes it, give you examples around it. But here's the point, starting with these three in the middle, to build around that very powerful research-based instructional strategies that are flexible and that focus on building the capacity of the learner. So you'll see in that learner voice, you'll see learner choice, multiple instructional strategies, and cultural responsiveness. Now, two things about this. One is that we could put a lot more out there. We could overwhelm you. What we tried to do was get those instructional strategies that tend to be most universal and that have behind them the most powerful research. But you'll also notice that there are some open cells around in each of these levels. This is a place for you to personalize the model. So if you're doing inquiry-based learning or project-based learning or challenge-based learning, you might put in one of these cells, this is the work we're doing right now, to help build out this work for us. At the next level out, what we call the green level is really about changing relationships and roles. What are the relationships? How does that change when learners stop being just compliant, passive recipients and are now active co-planning participants? Things like building learner independence, shared commitment to success, family engagement, co-designers of learning. And you'll see here also are some open cells that might be for learners who are doing in-depth. It might be learner as expert. It could actually be educator as learner within the context of the work we're doing. And then around the outside, structures and policies, the things that we've typically gone to that, by the way, aren't very powerful change levers on their own, but we need them to shore up and stabilize and sustain the work. So we need things like recognition of anytime, anywhere learning, and learning aligned grouping options, those kinds of things, schedules, calendars, the things that hold this together. Now, many people looking at this say, that's overwhelming, I couldn't do that. I agree. What we've come up with is the idea of building constellations, where you take a core element and then build around that some instructional strategies. So just thinking about a learner profile, really getting to know the learner, part of that may be infusing learner voice and choice. It may be around building shared commitment to success, and it may involve learning aligned grouping processes. So what I've done now is just taken this model and narrowed it way down into something that I can do on my journey, something that I'm ready to try. Because what we found is if you do just one or two things, you get a response from students that encourage us to do more. So here's a way of sort of thinking about, and by the way, I'm going to do a session after this, and just in terms of kind of an open-ended conversation, we can spend a lot more time on honeycomb if you're interested in that. Here's another way of thinking about this, and I'm going to give you a chance to talk about it for a second, and that is, some people think of this like personalized or not personalized. In reality, this is a journey for learning. There are times when, as educators, we need to take a more active role and personalize to the learning. This often happens when the content is brand new, the skill set is brand new, or the learner is immature. Our goal is not to stay here. This is the starting place. We can't sustain personalizing to the learner. Most of our work needs to be in the middle, personalizing with the learner, where we're co-engaging in this work. We're building learner capacity to be able to be more independent. And we're negotiating what's happening together. And then over to the far right, learner-driven, this is the place where learners take the lead. This could be in the context of passion projects or design work, or an area where a learner really wants to investigate more, and we're going to play a role of supporter and coach. All three of these are part of this work. We'll spend most of our time in the middle, but there are times when we need to be more proactive in terms of how we're positioning and casting the learning, and there are times we need to step back and let the learner learn. I'm going to just stop for a moment. If you would, think about your own practice. At times when you play the role of personalizing to the learner, work you're doing that's personalizing with the learner, and if you have them, those times when you're allowing learners to do the personalization. So here's what, the acronym is POWER. We need to create powerful learners. How do we do that? 5 things, and I would just say you can start this with your learners as early as tomorrow morning. Here's the first piece. Spend time with learners around the purpose of what we're asking them to learn. Invite learners to come up with that rationale. You can share it with them. You can explore it together. But here's the point. The more we can help learners understand the purpose for their learning, the more likely learning will occur and the longer they're likely to retain it. The second is a sense of ownership. We talked about this already a little bit. Giving learners an opportunity to have voice and choice and set goals for their learning gives them a sense of ownership for it. That begins to shift this sort of dynamic from learning is what I do because adults force me to and I don't have a choice, to learning is what I do because it's important in my life, that I own it. It's something no one can take from me. The third piece, wonder, curiosity. In a rapidly changing world, curiosity works often like radar, that I'm constantly pinging what's going on around me. And when I have curiosity, I am far more likely to recognize change and the need to learn than are people who without that gift. How do we build curiosity? Ask really good open-ended questions. Or think of this. Resist the temptation to pre-chew the content that you're going to give to students. Let them have some raw meat. It's okay. It's okay. That's often where the wonder is. It's where the struggle is, but it's also where the satisfaction is. What good is it to eat food someone's already chewed? Seriously. You follow me? But we do that often in an effort to make it easy for kids. We can't always make it easy. Third piece, efficacy. This is the idea of constantly coaching learners that if they use good strategies, if they use good effort, if they use their resources, they can learn really difficult things. In fact, the more they do it, the better they are, the better able they're going to be to learn really difficult things. And the last one, responsibility. Here's what's interesting. We take responsibility willingly for things that are important to us. Having a sense of purpose, ownership, wonder, efficacy actually combine to create an important, meaningful learning experience that students often want to take responsibility for. We often criticize students for not being responsible when what we really mean is, why don't they do what I tell them? True responsibility is, I own it. I take care of it. I'll make sure it happens. We do that when we have value. The more we can create value in learning, the more likely learners are to take responsibility for it. Thank you very much. I appreciate your attention and time today. Good luck.